Bryan J.L. Glass's Dark Spaces. Part 1, Stratan Dreams. Book 1, Desolation's Tears. Read by the author. Chapter 13, Revelation and Abomination. 1. Merrin left his rental cubicle in exactly the same state as it had been when he'd arrived. He'd required no entertainment, nor even a meal. Just a spot of warmth to see him through the frosty afternoon. Now it was back out into the cold to determine just how much trouble he and/or his assignment might actually be in. He was still musing over the morning's events, pondering whatever greater meaning might be hidden within such otherwise chance encounters, as he prepared for his return to the scene of a crime. Not the labyrinth of back alleys stalked by predatory children, but to that of his dead contact. As Merrin walked the frozen streets, he sensed how the general tenor of Redemption's remaining population, albeit fewer out and about on the open streets, had hardened into a sharper fear and an even harsher anger than during his earlier tour of the city. The flash shield activity that had dominated the warehouse district that afternoon had dispersed, with far more pressing concerns now dominating their efforts since the life pod had crash-landed that morning. Merrin glanced about the otherwise vacant street, then ducked under the flapping security tape. He pulled a universal override card from a hidden slot in his waist belt, disabled the alarm, and unlocked the door in seconds. He entered cautiously, with all his senses heightened. The place was dry and musty like an old cellar. There was music playing in the primary storeroom, the folk music of Desolation's indigenous Hadiac ice tribes, primarily percussion and throat singing. The Hadiacs weren't truly indigenous, as most understood the term, but as conscripted labor from the Hadean strata nearly 3,000 years earlier, when Desolation was designated ore-rich beneath its devastating storms. Those early penal colonists pioneered all the mining techniques unique to what inevitably became their adopted home. Merrin followed the native beat and discerned the sounds of industrious rummaging. He peered through the open door as unobtrusively as possible. There was a dark-hued man, approximately 30 to 40 Stratan Standard years old. Stocky like many purebred Golians, most probably a Desolation native, sorting through a box of old manuscripts. Merrin thought it best to not do anything alarming. He stepped back from a direct line of sight, then leaned forward, exposing only his head and shoulders, just in case the man was armed and easily startled. He rapped twice on the doorframe and said, "Hello?" The man looked around in surprise, and Merrin ensured that both of his own hands were in view, empty and waving. "Can I help you?" the man asked suspiciously. Merrin saw him grab a crowbar used for prying open shipping crates. With no weapon to threaten him with, Merrin stepped into the doorframe, suggesting as much innocence in his stance as he could convey. "Excuse me, but I had an appointment to meet with Professor Strach," Merrin said, believing he should be as open as circumstances allowed. "You see, my flight was delayed, and, The man pulled the crowbar into a two-handed grip and asked, "Are you Merrin, with an interest in antiquities?" Merrin smiled widely. "Why, yes, I am," he said. Although the query concerning antiquities was to be my line. From halfway across the large cavernous room, Merrin could feel the man's relief practically exude from his pores. He put the crowbar down, seemingly without another thought. He advanced with an extended hand, saying with a grin, "Sorry, but Professor Strock was supposed to answer. Frozen hell isn't for the weak, no matter how native they think they are." They met midpoint and clasped hands. "I am Dr. Haverel Sintel, the new planetary biologist," he said. "And I am simply Merrin. What happened?" Dr. Sintel sighed dejectedly. "Before my spontaneous promotion this afternoon, I was Strock's assistant with another decade yet before I inherited the position. I arrived at my usual time, about an hour later than the professor, and nothing was amiss. I unlocked the door, relocked it behind me, called out, no answer, and then I found him in the office and called it in." Merrin showed his surprise. Sintel gave a sad laugh. I was a suspect for all of 15 minutes. There simply wasn't any motive, and they knew it. "I understand the authorities suspect a gambling debt." "Strock was no gambler," Haverel declared, then gestured for Merrin to follow him into the office. "Then you suspect it was connected to the Miners' Guild?" "No miner pulled the trigger," Sintel said decisively. "Strock was an intermediary, and only a handful of guild leaders even knew his identity." They entered the office with its smattering of crime scene investigation paraphernalia still scattered about, and Merrin noticed Sintel would not go near nor even look for long at the desk where his boss had died. Merrin gave the room a cursory scan, adding, "Could it have been an organized crime hit if knowledge of what he was up to leaked—" "What is that?" Merrin was startled, for against the wall behind him, in prime view from the desk, and the last thing Merrin saw as he completed his scan, hung a hideous painting. Sintel exhibited a little smirk and shook his head slowly. I'm sorry. I should have warned you," he said. He gestured to the massive, nearly 2 by 3 meter painting. "That is Professor Hakem Strock's Kokor." Merrin was uncharacteristically speechless. 2. After a few moments, Merrin collected himself enough to inquire further regarding the repulsive image in the late Professor Strock's office. "What is it?" "Nobody knows," Sintel admitted. "Strock had some theories, but most of it is mythology. Collective subconscious shike. He told me this painting was found in an underground church, hidden from the eye don't eye, and smuggled out by private collectors over 1,000 years ago. The image was predominantly black, with varying degrees of the darkest gray set against orange flames and red coals. The only bright tones were to highlight the sheen of an oily carapace and accentuate the 3 rows of surprisingly human teeth that descended back from its pronounced maw. Merrin muttered incredulously, "This was an object of worship?" The creature at the heart of the painting's infernal conflagration was primordial. The viewer's repulsion instinctual, as if either this oil paint rendition represented what man almost became but for a quirk of genetic fate, or what the human race might still be destined to become. All of our reason, our questions, art, compassion submerged within a monstrosity that would never again allow those more noble aspirations to rise to its surface. It stared out from the painting with eyes it didn't seem to physically possess, and saw beneath the meat of our flesh to the soul within, reminding us of how weak and fragile a species we truly are. Sintel picked up where he had trailed off. There was an altar and purported evidence of human sacrifice. But all of that could have been window dressing, fabrication to make a better story, or maybe what somebody else used it for after finding it later. Who knows? Merrin did not believe Sintel's dismissals. This beast demanded something from humanity, and whatever was not sacrificed willingly, then that it would take by force, feeding upon our impotent terror. It possessed 6 limbs, like an insect, yet the armored middle arms were human enough with opposable thumbs, as if the clavicle bones had been elongated outward, then compressed to the sides of an outer ribcage, allowing the upper talons to unfold out from the shifted scapula in a nightmarish mockery of the human form. The brain pan collapsed down into the neck, while the lower jaw jutted from that stem. Merrin knew there was only a single word for the manifestation on canvas, but no matter how hard he concentrated, it evaded his conscious thoughts. The teeth, at least the innermost of the 3 rows, were undoubtedly human, as if the original artist had something important to say by adding such detail. Merrin almost stammered. I can't look at it any longer. But you can't look away, Sintel added, casting his own gaze to the floor. The power of it compels you, like an icon. There is nothing holy in this image, Merrin uttered as he forced himself to turn away. It's an abomination, he said finally, knowing such was still not the word that remained elusively beyond his call. But he knew that this painted visage was now emblazoned in his mind and would haunt his dreams for weeks to come. Well, that's one word for it, Sintel conceded. But this isn't why you came. I'm sorry I brought you in here. I can tell you it freaked out the flash cops more than a little. So, small victories where the cause can get them. Merrin's hand shook, and it took all his mastered disciplines to rein it back under his control. You know so much of Strock's intel, Merrin said. Might you know if he had a backup liaison? Aye, Sintel said with a nod. You're looking at his original conduit to the mining guild. I was his assistant in more than just planetary biology. Then you understand why I was dispatched here. Merrin was still feeling out this unexpected change in his assignment. Strock was to represent the guild in their desire to join the secessionist cause against Comfed. You're here to let us know the hard truths about what that's going to entail. Us? Merrin queried. Only native desolationists are allowed in the guild. That's actually one of the things Comfed is trying to shake up. So my neck is on the line too. Merrin's optimism was finally returning. If only he could get that damned painting out of his mind. I have a significant presentation to make, but the more immediate short version is that not all secessionists and separatists are fighting overtly in the open. The cause is served even if ore production is reduced by 1/5. The majority of what's being stripped out of this planet under the Comfed juggernaut is going to their suppression forces, their war machine. If defiance escalates as we hope, we give them less to work from and they'll have less to fight back with, opening the door to every planet or stratum that seeks an out from an ever-failing regime. Then what comes after Comfed? Sintel asked. That is always tomorrow's question, Merrin answered. For the present, I will always fight for today. Merrin could sense Sintel was weighing the cost, now that Strock was no longer facilitating. but he was definitely still willing to do his part. I have details on many ways the guild can suppress output without confed bean counters ever growing wise to what is hampering their bottom line. You'll take my recommendations to the guild masters for their evaluation over the course of Frozen Hell, and then I'll be back the following season to receive their decision, yay or nay, or to take the negotiation to another level entirely. He stared Sintel in the eye. These matters are not to be entered into lightly, but with a sober mind and somber heart that doing the right thing may cost one their life. Sintel wore his heart on his sleeve, and his sincerity practically dripped onto the floor as he seemed to recall his predecessor's commitment. I understand, and you can count on me. Merrin's piercing, wide-set eyes softened. That is good to know. He smiled, changing the mood entirely. Now tell me, what necessitated such a swift promotion on your part? Confed committees usually take months to come to such decisions. Sintel shook his head and gestured to the painting behind Merrin's head. Possibly that. Merrin didn't need to follow the gesture for his skin to break out in chills beneath the warmth of his inner skin suit. He was aghast. Why in all the strata would you even suggest something like that? Sintel was somber. I don't know if you've heard, but Redemption's got a monster on its hands, and Desolation needs a scapegoat. Lose one planetary biologist, promote another. He raised his hand sheepishly. Merrin dared glance back over his shoulder at what he knew was still there, possibly to see if it had changed or moved in any way. The flash guard gave me a report on the victims, and the only thing in all the strata that matches what this thing is doing is something out of mythology. It eats, but it doesn't digest. Do you get what I'm saying? Merrin was at a loss. Is that what you see when you look at this painting? No, Sintel said, flustered. That's what's happening outside. This thing just eats and defecates without processing anything. It's driven by a hunger that is never satisfied. Merrin stared again at the painted maw and its human teeth. It's not there, Sintel reiterated. It's in the documents. What documents? In the storeroom. Strock collected them. The biology of myths and legends was his hobby. It's taken me most of the day just to identify which bits are relevant. There's a lot of weird shike in the dark corners of the strata that's never been part of officially sanctioned history, and this beastie's been just another anecdote. Until now. Three. Sintel guided Merrin back to the storeroom and the cases he was opening when Merrin first arrived. Yeah, Sintel conveyed, equally shaken by the implications. This thing, in one form or another, is a legend on over a dozen worlds up and down the strata. Nothing was printed. Anything that could be read was handwritten, and from over a dozen languages that preceded the common Stratan tongue. There were drawings, sketches, photos of sketches, holovids of cave scrawls that otherwise couldn't be removed and collected. Everything original was carefully preserved in thin archival casings with removable lids if the actual substance and texture of the item were deemed as important to study as the text or imagery itself. This is it, Sintel declared. Everything we know about Strock's Kakor. Merrin was mesmerized by an image on one parchment in particular, a sketched counterpart to the painting in the office, Strock's notes indicating their artistry had been separated by 5 strata and over 300 years between renditions. As he began to lift its case, Sintel admonished, "There's nothing here that isn't over 1,000 years old. Touch them the wrong way and we'll lose whatever leads they offer." Merrin wasn't used to being chastised by anyone but his late father, but his normally thin eyes widened at the plethora of knowledge laid out before him. "My apologies. I'll not allow my enthusiasm to get the better of me," he promised. He took Sintel's silence as approval to proceed with caution. Merrin felt drawn to this kind of mystery, to understand even those things which resisted understanding, a compulsion that had always prompted his worst decisions, his rashest actions. He suspected, even as he began to carefully sift through the material, that this choice would prove no different. This has been Bryan J.L. Glass's Dark Spaces, Book 1, Desolation's Tears, read by the author. Audio and video production by A.J. Blackburn. Original music composed and performed by Frankie Caffrey. Bryan J.L. Glass's Dark Spaces and BJLG's Dark Spaces are copyright 2022 by Bryan J.L. Glass.